amazing Australians and the story of their lives. You're tuned to Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald.
Hello and welcome, listeners. Tanya Heaslip, who was born at the height of the Cold War, which was to shape her later life, grew up in a remote cattle station in outback Australia. Is the author of 3 books, An Alice Girl, Beyond Alice, Alice to Prague. Having been sent to boarding school at a young age, she had to learn how to deal with a life totally different to the one she knew. In 1994, after studying law, she moved to the Czech Republic, where she taught English, and her life took a turn in a different direction. Not necessarily the way Tanya would have liked, but let's find out why. Welcome, Tanya.
Thank you, Rosemary. What a wonderful introduction.
Oh, thank you. Tanya, tell us about your childhood on that remote cattle station. I mean, first of all, how remote was it?
It was the 60s, Central Australia, north of Alice Springs. It was a one-day trip to get from our homestead into Alice Springs.
Right.
And my mother went about once a month to get supplies and pick up books from School of the Air for me from the library. So we were very remote. Central Australia back in the 60s and early 70s was, the rest of the world didn't exist. We were our own community, as many isolated rural places are.
Yes.
We had 1,000 miles from north to south to any capital city.
Isn't that extraordinary? Now, you said at that time, which was sort of in the 60s and 70s, I mean, you worked as hard as any stockman. I love the photo of you on the horse on the front of your book, but you basically were little stockmen, weren't you?
Yes,
Or
we
women.
were. We were little. Yeah. Well, we thought of ourselves as little men in a man's world because back then that seemed like the greatest accolade we could receive. So we applied that to ourselves. But that's what we did. We worked side by side with the stockman,
Yes.
dawn till dusk, mustering cattle on horseback out, miles from the homestead, day after day.
And you helped your mother, of course, because we actually had Jenny Old on here, who wrote a wonderful book called Back of Beyond, that was also in the 60s. And she said one of the hardest things was feeding all the stockmen and all the workers that came through the farm. So your mother had a huge job, didn't she? And you helped her there.
Yeah. Well, she would be feeding up to 20 to 30 stockmen a day. And that would be breakfast, lunch and dinner, except when they were out in the stock camp, in which case she had to pack huge tucker boxes that would go out on the horses initially, pack horses, or then in old Land Rovers that would crawl out through the mulga and the red dirt to find a camp. But actually, most of the time, we children were working with the men. And in fact, Mum wouldn't allow us in the kitchen very much. We had to do all the cleaning up, all the work after meals, and setting the table. But we weren't allowed near the cooking because that was a huge process. And besides, Dad thought we were more useful on horseback. So as a result, I'm not a great cook.
He wanted you out there doing the work. But, I mean, between all of that, Tanya, of course, you had to learn. So initially you did School of the Air. How much of your day would that fill in?
School of the Air itself only took half an hour each day, but we also did correspondence school lessons in a little stone schoolroom from 7:30 in the morning until 1 o'clock each day when we were at home, when we weren't out working. The correspondence school lessons fitted around Dad's mustering agenda, so we were in that schoolroom when it suited him, but that was the time that was required to finish the correspondence school lessons, and then we had half an hour on the two-way radio, which was unbelievably exciting.
It would have been, and put you in connection because, of course, how big was the property, Tanya?
The property was 700 square miles, which was a very small property compared to most properties here. To be viable, they have to be about 3,000 square miles.
Yes.
So it was very small. It meant Dad had to work extra hard.
So the connection that you had on School of the Air with teachers and possibly other children was very important to you, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Now, we couldn't see each other, but we could hear each other's voices, so we could paint pictures in our minds as to what our fellow students look like, which, for isolated outback kids in the 60s and 70s was about as exciting as it got, because we were surrounded by stockmen, adults,
Yes.
horses, cattle, dogs, but not other kids.
Right, right. How many children are in the family?
4.
So you had
Um,
at least you had their company when you didn't want to kill them. That was probably
Yeah, exactly. Well, I was the eldest. Then there was my sister and my brother in quick succession, only 14 months between us. So we
right.
grew up a bit like triplets. Then there was my youngest brother who came along some years later, and I was 7 by then. So I essentially grew him up.
Yep,
He spent all his time on my hip, because mum was,
yep.
busy cooking. So it was a very, very close relationship between the 4 of us.
Oh, how lovely! I was actually spent my very early days on a property in Ireland, and one of 5
Oh,
children. So we were pretty isolated in the backwaters down below Galway. But I am not as isolated as you are or you were. But now, Tanya, tell us, we were lucky enough not long ago to have a representative from the Flying Doctors on here to chat, which was just wonderful. Can you remember when you were on the station there? Did you have to? Well, you did have to call them in, and can you remember any of those incidents at all?
the Royal Flying Doctor Service, I don't think actually ever came to us, because back then there was one plane and it covered a huge, huge area. So most of the time, most stations like us had some sort of kit, and mum had to help dress wounds and the like, and then people would be bumped into town in a bumpy old vehicle. But back then they mostly flew the big distances out to the
R-
WA border, and hundreds of miles. But they were very big in our world because they did the medical report every morning on the two-way radio before School of the Air, and we'd all listen in and find out what was happening out on the stations. And I always thought it was a terribly romantic occupation for them.
But now, Tanya, suddenly, and I can relate to this because I was pushed off to boarding school as well, but suddenly your idyllic life as working as a little stock girl, or stock, well, you were regarded as a big stock girl on there, it suddenly came to an end, and you were sent off to boarding school, which was just such a totally and completely different life that you, well, in actual fact, your poor mother received a telegram, didn't she, saying, "Come get me. I want to be out of here," virtually.
It was terrible. All bush kids knew they had to go to boarding school.
Yeah.
We bush kids here in the Territory, because we didn't have the secondary school options. But it didn't make it any less brutal going from the freedom of the outback and School of the Air, then to this 700 girl school. This boarding school had been built along Victorian lines, and
Yes.
it was we were like little numbers. It felt like we were in prison, and we were just completely regulated by rules. There was no more freedom. I didn't understand the weather. It was so cold. And on a station, little kids are given huge responsibilities, and we worked
Yes.
alongside the men and we'd deliver. But in this boarding house, you were just considered a naughty girl from the start, who had to be regulated and punished and pulled into line until I think their goal was a bit army-like, and that was that you just turn everybody into a singular obedient mass.
It's very, very hard. Well, I found it hard enough, but you, I would imagine, coming from such an isolated area and living such a free life, would have found it so much harder. But tell me now, you did make some very good friends, because obviously there were other girls in a similar situation, perhaps not quite similar, but getting towards a similar situation to you. And you do say that you made some lifelong friendships.
Yes, I think there were 2 great things about boarding school that it took me a long time to realize, but the first actually was immediate. So you thrust all these 12-year-old girls who are like young fillies with trembling limbs and, all gawky and lanky together. And so we quickly became each other's family because we didn't have families. So when you're in a dormitory and and you're feeling oppressed. You become each other's family, each other's best friends, and lifelong friends. And the second great thing, but it took me a long time to realise that, was it gave me the education to go on to have an extraordinary career, which I otherwise wouldn't have had. But in terms of those girls, we are all still friends today to the core.
Oh, it's lovely. I'm actually about to go and have a cup of coffee with a girl I met when I was 10 and sent, well, actually, I exaggerate. I was 12, I think, when I was sent to boarding school. But it's lovely to have those friendships. But homesickness, of course, is something you would have suffered dreadfully from. And in your book,
terribly.
In your book, Beyond Alice, of course, you do talk about that time, don't you?
Yeah, that my homesickness was unbelievable. It just ate me away. I longed for home. I was desperate for home. That feeling of crawling into a bed at night and pulling the covers over and just wanting to disappear, and then dreaming that you're home, and then waking up and it's the gong and a mistress shouting for us all to get up and go to the shower in order of the roster. And just that deep grief inside of me. And it's a deep, silent grief that really has lived with me for my whole life. It's never gone. And when I lived all over the world in different places, which I have and I loved, nonetheless, that grief, it's always just there, just under the surface.
You never actually forget it. But now, Tanya, you went on to train as a lawyer. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, I didn't know what I was going to do when I finished school. My main interest was to visit the world. I just wanted to escape and see all these lands that I'd read about in my storybooks as a child. And I loved modern European history at school. It's my favourite topic. So I wanted to get to Europe, and I realised, to become a foreign correspondent and travel the world and tell people stories. But as it transpired, I got into law, and the teachers persuaded me that I should do it. So I went into law without having any idea really what law was about. And I kept trying to leave law through my whole studies. I just thought, this is not for me. But it was a fantastic training, and it ended up giving me an amazing career, and also a wonderful, wonderful suite of friends as well that to this day I'm still so closely connected with.
Where did you do your degree?
Adelaide yes. Law School, which was part of the University of Adelaide.
And then when you finished that, you went off to Europe. So tell us a little bit about that, because it was about the time that the Berlin Wall came down, and as you say, you just had to go and see what it was like. I mean, what was it like, and what was Europe like at that time?
Well, it was quite amazing. Well, I'd practiced by then for a number of years, but I was still longing to get to Europe. So I put on my backpack and went, left my firm, and was told I'd never get back on the corporate legal ladder again, but off I went.
Right.
And Europe at that time was interesting. I did find beautiful places that reminded me of my childhood books, like Heidi from Switzerland and the children of Enid Blyton's adventures, oak trees and meadows and fields. But the world had moved on, and I was at a loss. I realised that I couldn't find what I was looking for. But then I was just about to come back to Australia, and a friend of mine were in London, and we saw the Berlin Wall falling on a television screen in a pub, and we got the last 2 tickets the next day onto a flight into Berlin with the world's media. Yes. And I saw it, and it completely changed my life, because I'd been taught that the Cold War would be here forever, that the Berlin Wall would be here forever, communism, the totalitarian regimes across the Soviet Union could never, ever dissolve. And yet in front of my eyes, the power of the human will was expressing itself, and it was just amazing. I thought there and then, I got my bit of wall, thought, I've got to come back. I've got to see what's on the other side of that wall.
And we'll talk about that in a minute. But you're listening to Lots to Chat About. I'm Rosemary Peterswald, and my guest today is Tanya Heaslip. You did, which we'll go on to talk about now, you then decided to go to a little small town in the Czech Republic. where you were going to teach English. Tell us about that time and how music sort of connected you to the people in that town.
Well, I jumped to the Czech Republic because I didn't really know where to go, and a legal colleague here set me up teaching English for 3 months in this little town called Sedlčany, which was an hour and a half south of Prague. And
Right.
when I landed there, communism had fallen, but it was taking a long time to dismantle. And in these country towns, it was still, frankly, alive and well. And I was so lonely because I didn't understand a word of Czech. Nobody spoke English except for a handful of the teachers.
Right.
And I felt like I'd gone back to boarding school. I had those same terrible feelings. And I thought, what have I done? Huge mistake. But the children saved me, the students. And I discovered that they loved music. I loved music. I played guitar around a campfire with the Stockman growing up. I played guitar at school. That's what saved me. All the boarding school girls would sing along with me, all my
Oh,
country
how
songs.
lovely.
And I discovered that the Czech people played guitars and sat around fires and sang what was the equivalent of their country music, basically folk music, ballads, lots of ballads. And I had this extraordinary connection because I discovered that they were as isolated really as I had once been as a child. They knew
Yes.
nothing about the West. They'd been protected. So even though we didn't have language in common, we had music, and that gave us a soul connection. And to this day, I have the most precious friends who were students and teachers at that town, Sedlčany.
Oh, how lovely. I mean, the Czechs, they can be a little bit suspicious and untrusting of strangers. I mean, I remember going to the small village of Buktovic where my husband's family have connections and being treated with great suspicion. But, I mean, when you hear of their history, I mean, it's quite understandable, isn't it?
Yeah, when I got there, I was greeted with blank faces, angry faces. People would look away from me. So the West had been painted as this most wicked
Yes.
place, and I came from the West. And even though communism had fallen and that they were ideally embracing, a market economy in the ways of the West, they were not doing that in Sedlčany. And I was treated with such suspicion, and I was by nature a very tactile person, and they didn't like being touched.
Right.
They didn't like my friendly smiles, my
Yes.
Australian cheery overtures. But the more I did it, the worse the reception. So it took me a while to find my feet.
It, I can imagine so. And of course, now we come to Alice to Prague, which is your last book. You went to live there for about 2.5 years when you were about in your early 30s, I think, and you fell madly in love. But it sort of didn't quite work out as you imagined it, did it?
No, it didn't. So I met these extraordinary Czech Australian men. They called themselves Czech Australian because they'd escaped in 1968 during the Prague Spring
Right.
and spent the last several decades in Australia. And they'd gone back because communism had fallen. They'd gone back to reclaim their homes and their families. And I met them by chance, and they took me to Prague and introduced me to this extraordinary man called Karel, who was an engineer, who was their friend who'd never left. And he was a poet, a musician as well. He loved everything about Prague. And he said, yes, come and stay with me while you look for work here. And as it transpired, he had 2 daughters, which I hadn't realised.
Right. Right.
He was this very young spirit. He was older than me, but just I'd never met such a young spirit. And I fell madly in love with this, just his way of looking on the world, his way of thinking. He'd quote poetry under the moonlight. I
Oh.
mean, what was not to love? And he played guitar, and we'd
Oh.
sing together, and it was incredibly romantic. And one of the things that I had frustrated me in Australia was that all the men I grew up with everywhere, all they were interested in was sport. And
Right.
yet here was a man who quoted poetry and played music, and I just loved that. But of course, we had, he spoke English quite well.
Yes.
He'd learned it from the BBC in secret. So it was very stilted, old fashioned English.
Yes.
So our language never quite met. And of course, because I couldn't speak Czech, I could only teach. and I wanted to get back into law. And I worked for the Ministry of Justice and judges of the High Court and could see the opportunities there, but I would never have been able to because I couldn't speak Czech well enough or write Czech well enough. And I realised that there was a bar beyond which I could not go if I lived in this society. And
Yes.
Carl's view was, well, that basically is the way it is. And he had this very cynical view about love that I think was the result of so much oppression and so much sadness and fear and all the things that had gone wrong in his life.
Yes.
He believed nothing was permanent, everything was ephemeral, and he said love wouldn't last.
And it's it's very difficult with not just the age difference, but two cultures, isn't it? And living from one end of the world to the other. He wasn't going to give up what he had to follow you to Australia, and probably vice versa. That was it, wasn't it?
Yes, and I was in my early 30s. I was still wildly idealistic and optimistic, and I really thought I could make a life there until it became, increasingly obvious I could only go to that certain limit.
Yes.
And Karel couldn't leave. He had daughters, and he'd chosen not to leave in 1968 during the Prague Spring. Prague was his home. He was a Czech man, and so in the end, it was inevitable that we would have to part. But it was terribly, terribly hard. It was
It is.
When you're so young,
Yep.
full of hope, and then you realise, no, it's not going to work. It's so hard.
It is. But then, of course, you came home to Australia, you married, and you lived by the Todd River back in Alice. So, I mean, life obviously turned out wonderfully or whatever for you. I have to ask you now what Chris, the station manager, said here. You live by the Todd River, and evidently the way that you can work out whether somebody is a local in Alice Springs is to ask them, how many times have you seen the Todd River flood? So how many times have you seen it flood?
Oh my goodness, thousands probably. No, it's never flowed. It's never flowed thousands. But if you're lucky, once a year, sometimes 3 times a year, sometimes once every 2 or 3 years.
Right.
But just to answer your previous point, yes, I came home. It was quite some years before I then felt safe again.
Yes.
To love. And then, yes, I found the wonderful husband for me, which, so it was perfect and ultimately meant to be. And it's wonderful being back here in Central Australia.
And you're working as a lawyer again, is that right?
Yeah, apart from my time in Prague, I never stopped working as a lawyer. So I worked before I went overseas, and when I came back, I kept working. So I've worked as a lawyer all these years in different places. I
Right.
spent a lot of time in the West, in WA, in the Territory, practice in South Australia as well, all over the place, and I've done sort of every different type of law you could imagine.
And you were or are president of the Northern Territories Writers' Centre, aren't you?
Yes, that was a 4-year term, which I finished, and so now stepped down. But that was an enormous privilege and exciting, and I loved it. Yeah, I love being involved in writing and books, and I think I can link that back with huge thanks to Mrs. Hodder, our School of the Air teacher, and my mother, who brought those books out every month from the School of the Air library to me and my sister and my brothers, and we would devour them and the stories of the outside world. So I've never stopped my love of stories.
Oh, how lovely. But Tanya, now, we hear a little bit about, well, quite a lot actually, about violence in Alice Springs at the moment. Just tell us what it's like living there at the moment.
Alice Springs is wonderful. It's very, very distressing. I think the media have exacerbated some of the issues we've had here. COVID was a very difficult time, and there was violence here, and the media ran it 24/7 nationally and internationally on a loop. And as a result, there are these awful stories. Just people say, "Oh, is it safe to come there?" Of course it is. Every country town, every city in Australia has issues.
Yes.
Alice Springs is no different, but it's a wonderful place to live. The weather is amazing, although it can be very hot in summer. But the community is so rich. We have 62 different nationalities living in Central Australia. It's vibrant. It's mixed. We've got every kind of artistic opportunity here that you could want, every kind of work opportunity. It's dynamic, and most people come to Alice from somewhere else.
Yes.
So it's very, very vibrant, and a bit like boarding school. People have to make their own families here. Huge sporting community. It's a wonderful place to live. Yeah. And just like every city, there are certain places you wouldn't walk at night.
Right. But that's the same as you say, anywhere, really.
Yeah.
Now, Tanya, have you got any more books in the pipeline?
Yes, I'm trying to write fiction now.
Right.
It's taking me a long time because fiction I'm finding is very, very difficult. Memoirs, I had the stories,
Yes.
and I could write so many more memoirs, so many more stories about things and places I've been through. But I'm trying the art of fiction, which, yes, is taking me a while. But I've got a young protagonist called Kate, who's a young lawyer in Alice Springs, and they're kind of mystery set in Central Australia. So bit by bit, I'm working on them, and I hope to have a series of them when I'm finished.
Oh, how lovely. Yes, I have written a memoir, but also a bit of fiction, and they are, they are totally different. Tanya, we are running out of time, sadly, but tell me, I mean, most of our listeners, or many of them, but many aren't, are sight impaired. So are your books, well, they are on audio, I think, aren't they? But do you read them?
They're not on audio, sadly. That's the one thing they're not. And I would like to.
Right. Yes.
And I would like to read them myself. That's a project for the future. But the books are big. They're in big print. And I have a lot of sight impaired people who look at them and go, oh, this is great. I can read this.
Right.
So they can get the books from any bookshop. If they don't have them, they can order them in, or they can get them online, and they are all, people can read them quite easily. Told.
Paul, we might have to get Janice to read one of them.
We may do, yes.
Absolutely, because we have a lovely lady here who reads books on for RPH for us, and she does actually like to read ones that aren't available on audio. But now, Tanya, your webpage is Tanya, TanyaHeaslip.com.au. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
And so your books are available online and in bookshops. And look, I'll just go through which ones they are so people can have a look at it. There's Alice Girl, Beyond Alice, and Alice to Prague. And keep an eye out for a fiction book going to be set in Alice as well. But thank you very, very much, Tanya Heaslip, for being my guest today. Thank you, Paul, for producing.
Thank you.
And this program has been produced in the studios of 4RPH Reading Radio in Brisbane for syndication around Australia, and will be available on my YouTube channel, Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald. But thank you, Tanya, and thank you, Paul.
Thank you so much, Rosemary and Paul. I've loved it.
It's been terrific. Thank you, Tanya.
Great friends and great chats. That was another Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald. Stay tuned next week for another amazing chat.